Welcome to episode 15 of All About Your Benjamins, the podcast. Usually I'm introducing a guest right now, but this week, as you heard in the intro, it's just me. We're going to do a little bit of a listener's questions or an Ask Me Anything type of episode for number 15. It's been a little while since I've had a podcast, still trying to figure out balancing, running my firm, putting out content on the blog, doing videos, meeting with clients, doing financial planning, and then also spending a lot of time with my family. So I haven't mastered that yet to have a consistent podcast schedule, but I'm working on it. I think the goal is going to be to have one every couple of weeks, release it on Tuesdays. But as I get these guests lined up, we'll have that schedule, and I'll share with you when to expect new podcasts. So I apologize for the little lull, but I have a lot of great guests coming up later this summer. So be sure to tune in to the future podcast, subscribe so you don't miss anything. But for today's, let's go through a few questions that I received from some of the listeners. These were all via email, but you can feel free to email me at contact@allaboutyourbenjamins.com or find me on Twitter at Justin Castelli. You can send me a tweet, you can DM me, and we'd be happy to continue to compile a list of questions and do this periodically. So I have about 12 questions that I've received. We'll work through them, see how many we can get done in about 45 minutes or so. Won't go the full hour. The first one I'm pretty excited about because it's not even a finance related question. So you all know that finance is my first passion, but I love fitness and nutrition. And this question is regarding the podcast episode with Tim Hayes about nutrition and fitness, in particular intermittent fasting. So the question is asking whether or not you can have coffee while you're still in a fasted state. And if the answer is yes, can you have cream in your coffee, or will that break your fast? So the listener mentioned that they've heard a lot of conflicting reports. You can't have anything. You can have anything under 50 calories. Black coffee and tea is okay. Or if you're going to put anything in, you have to use full cream. So what's the right answer? Well, I went back to my buddy Tim Hayes, and before I get to his answer, I'm just going to throw my 2 cents in there. In that just like finance, nutrition and health has a lot of conflicting arguments and research to support whatever it is that you want to believe. So as the listener alluded to, you can find articles and data that says you should not have anything, that anything ingested will break your fast, or if you stay under 50 calories, whatever it is that you have, less than 50 calories, you're still fasting. So it's tough to figure out what's best. I think you've got to go with trial and error, and also looking at what are your goals, and maybe if your goals are not extreme, you give yourself a little bit of leniency. But if you have some very extreme goals and big goals, maybe you go to the tougher, more strict route. But let's go to what Tim said. I gave Tim a call, and he told me that from his research, his beliefs, general consensus says less than 40 calories, you preserve your fast. So the listener mentioned 50. I've always read 50. When Tim told me 40, that was a new number. So 40 to 50 calories, less than that, you should still be in a fasted state. However, one of his main resources and somebody he really looks up to, Dr. Rhonda Patrick, says that actually anything consumed breaks your fast, anything other than water. Because once you introduce something into the body, liver enzymes get kicked into action, and then now your fast is broken because your body's processing whatever it is you've introduced. So on one end you can't have anything. On the other end you can have under 50 calories. So right now we have an answer to the listener's question. So Tim said that what he recommends, what he tries to do is kind of split the difference. He is on a 8-hour eating window, so basically he's done eating at 8 o'clock at night, starts eating again at 12 o'clock, which is the same schedule that I try to operate on. He waits until 10 o'clock to have his first cup of coffee. So it's not fully up to his 12 o'clock window, but it's also not the first thing in the morning, so he's extended his fast a little bit further. He's pushed that cup of coffee out. That way, if Dr. Rhonda Patrick is right, he had that coffee very late in the fast, but if it doesn't matter, he's able to have the coffee and still enjoy that because that's a part of his morning routine. So the recommendation from my expert that I had on is to go ahead and have that cup of coffee, but if you can, push that out a little bit further than having it first thing in the morning. Now I know a lot of you, that's what gets you going in the morning. Maybe it will require you to change your morning routine to push that back out, have a nice cup of cold water. If you listen to Tim's podcast, it talked about that actually kicks up your metabolism. So have a cup of cold water early on, get your day going, get to the office, and then have your cup of coffee. He did say that if you are a person who likes to put some cream in your coffee, that you should go ahead and be able to do that. That's going to be playing off of the less than 50 calories. I can't imagine that you're putting that much cream in. Probably should not be putting in the flavored creams, but more of the full fat cream. A little bit of research that I did tying into this suggested that it's actually the introductions of carbohydrates that breaks your fast. So if you really want to be lenient, you can go ahead and maybe do the bulletproof coffee, which is some MCT oil, which is a strain of coconut oil, and grass-fed unsalted butter. I've read people saying that they are still in a fast by having a cup of bulletproof coffee, which is way, way more than 50 calories, but their justification is it's all fat, there's no carbohydrates, so the fast continues. I wasn't able to find as much information and data to support that. I've read it, but I didn't find a lot of research that suggests that. I think that if you're gonna do your coffee, have it, push it back, put cream in it, very little if you need be, and keep it all pretty basic until you get to that 12 o'clock or whatever your window to eat is allowed. So I hope that answers the questions. It is very frustrating. We talked about this when Tim was on the show. You know, I love health and nutrition, but it's frustrating to know what is the best thing to do. And I think you just kind of have to take a little bit. And at the end of the day, if Dr. Rhonda Patrick is right, and anything ingested breaks your fast, if all you're ingesting is a little bit of coffee, you're still going to probably get a lot of the benefits of fasting versus if you're eating a big breakfast. So you're not harming yourself. You might be lessening a little bit of the effect, but it's still gonna be better off than if you weren't fasting at all. So I hope that answers that question, but that is our first question, non-finance, which I love to be able to incorporate the fitness aspect as well. All right, for the rest of the show, the questions are all going to be financial planning and investment related. The next question is what one tip would I give someone who just started making quote unquote real money? And when I first read this question, I kind of chuckled because what's real money? Real money to one person could be totally different than another. So are we talking $100,000 a year, $500,000 a year, $75,000 a year? What's real money? But what I think they're really getting at is what's one tip to give somebody that all of a sudden is now making more money than they've ever made before? So whether that jump is from 75 to 500 or 50 to 80, whatever it might be, now that you have more income, what's one tip that I would give? And I love my one tip, not because I thought of it, but because it gives me the flexibility to wrap in a bunch of things inside of it. So my one tip to somebody that starts making good money, make real money all of a sudden, is to avoid what's called lifestyle creep. And lifestyle creep, we're all victims of it, but if you have a big jump in income, you could really have a huge increase in your lifestyle. And what that means is, as you make more money, you start spending more money. And not necessarily spending more money in a good way. So a negative lifestyle creep was you make more money and you go out and get a more expensive car, you get a bigger house, you're buying more clothes, and at the end of the day, you don't really notice that you're making more money other than you're buying more things. So I would tell you to avoid lifestyle creep. And the way that you can do that is through automation. You can automate a lot of savings to basically take that extra income that you've begun earning and put it elsewhere that's going to be helping you build wealth rather than collecting things. So to avoid lifestyle creep, you could contribute more to your 401k, you could contribute to a Roth IRA or traditional IRA, depending on what's better for you on your tax situation. You could pay down debt, you could build up your emergency fund if you don't have enough saved in that area. You can also just begin to invest in some low-cost funds. So there's a lot of things that you could do, but if you set that up to automatically occur so you don't even really see that money, then you will help yourself prevent increasing your standard of living too great just because you started making money. Now, with all that being said, I'm a big believer in finding balance. So I do think that if you do see your income rise because of your hard work, I do think you should reward yourself, whether that be a little bit of that extra income you take in the form of additional monthly income to give you more flexibility to enjoy life a little bit more, maybe have some more experiences, or you go out and treat yourself to a gift, if almost. I'm not saying you go out and buy a Tesla, but if you've been eyeing a pair of kicks, like a new pair of Jordans that are coming out, if you're me, or something else like that, then go ahead and splurge and buy that one thing you've been keeping your eye on, and then go back to saving and being responsible. So it's important to avoid that lifestyle creep, but I also think you need to find that balance for being financially responsible and also enjoying life. So do both. Don't go crazy with it, within moderation, but really try to avoid really increasing that standard of living just because you're making more money. In the long run, you'll look back and you'll have accumulated wealth and paid down debt, and your whole net worth statement will be much better off than if all of a sudden you find this windfall of income and you're spending it all on things that really don't even matter. So I mentioned I love that my answer of avoiding lifestyle creep wrapped in a bunch of things, because I could have said with new income you should save more, you should invest more, which are all things that I'm suggesting you should do by avoiding spending all this extra money that you have. So I try to avoid giving multiple answers to just a one tip type of question. So my one tip is lifestyle creep, which allows you to accomplish a lot of other goals in the process. So it's kind of two birds, one stone. So if you get that big bump in pay, reward yourself a little bit, maybe enjoy a little bit of it from month to month, but try to pretend like you didn't have that money like you're living before, and put that money elsewhere to build up that net worth, to give you more flexibility and freedom down the road, since I think that's what we're all striving for. So that's my answer to what to do when you start making that real money. And as we make our way through these questions, our next question is, what are 3 things that every young family should have in place regarding their finances? So I'm going to make an assumption here only because when I hear young family, I think kids are involved, kids are part of the picture. So my answer to this would be different if you were a single individual or if you were a young married couple. And I'll give you answers to those as well, but I want to focus more on the family side of things, assuming there's kids in the picture. So the 3 things I think every young family should have regarding their finances are 3 things that are very boring. A couple of them are things no one wants to talk about. I've written about them before, talked about them before, so if you've been following me, they're probably not a surprise. But a young family with kids, the first thing I think you should have is a will. The main reason you should have a will is not to disperse your assets, but to protect your kids in the event that, God forbid, mom and dad should pass away at the same time. The will allows you to determine who would take care of your kids financially and physically, depending if you want those people to be separate. So without a will, it's left up to the courts, and while we would think that our families and loved ones would act in a civilized manner, that doesn't always happen. So if you want to make sure that a specific family member or friend is the one who takes care of your kids if you're not here to take care of them, then the will is the way to make that done, or the way to make that happen. And then you can also establish somebody to be in charge of disposing any assets you may have, to make sure there's some checks and balances, which I recommend, and attorneys I've talked to traditionally recommend that as well, but it doesn't always have to be the case. So a will is the first thing, and it's mainly to make sure the kids are taken care of by whom you want them to be. The dispersing of assets and all that stuff is important, but I don't think it's as important, because most young couples, the majority of their assets are maybe some savings and retirement accounts, and your retirement accounts have beneficiaries, and when your will is set up, you will have most likely a trust that will spring into action for the kids' assets to go into. So I'm more concerned about making sure the kids are taken care of and are loved and happy if mom and dad aren't around, and hopefully that doesn't come into play. So it's a sucky conversation. It's one no one wants to have. It's a conversation you have really once. Go meet with the attorneys, get the documents drawn up, and then if anything changes in life, you have that conversation to update it. But once you have it in there, you should be in good shape. So will is number 1. We're talking about death, so we're going to continue this going, and life insurance is the second part. There's nothing that makes me more sick to my stomach that I can think of than seeing GoFundMe campaigns when there is a loss in a family. And usually that GoFundMe campaign is being run because whoever passed away did not have adequate life insurance to provide for the family. Now, we're young, or even if we're not young, for the most part, we think we're invincible. We think we're going to live long lives, and most of us will, but the longer you've been around, the more cases you see that life isn't always fair. And there are illnesses and there's accidents that take us away from our loved ones too early, which is sad in itself. And then to just compound that, if there's not a way to provide for family members, that makes it even worse. So now your family's left grieving your loss while trying to figure out how are they going to survive financially and move forward. So life insurance is another big one. It's also a controversial subject when you get into finance between advisors and insurance salespeople. What's the best type? That's another day, another conversation, another question. And actually there's a question further down that we're going to talk about as far as how much life insurance and what goes into that. But just listing 3 things that you need, life insurance would be the second. Working with a professional, you can figure out how much and what's the best type, but life insurance is number 2. And the third one, I went back and forth between what I decided was going to be my third is the emergency fund, and the other one is another type of insurance, disability insurance. I'd put that as 3B. So the importance of the emergency fund is just to make sure that if something happens, there's enough cash on hand to cover any short-term emergencies, whether that's loss of employment or something happening to the house, medical bills, just having cash on hand so that you're not having to go to credit and complicate things to pay for things you know you're going to need to pay for. So like I said, it was very close between that and disability insurance. I can make the argument that disability insurance is actually more important than the emergency fund, but I think that most people can get their emergency fund funded pretty quickly, which would allow them to move on to maybe a fourth item, which would be disability insurance. And a lot of times you might have disability coverage through your employer at a very basic level, where your employer is not going to give you an emergency fund. So I wouldn't necessarily there's a particular order, but I do list them this way because I think will is more important than your life insurance, than the emergency fund. But they kind of go together, so you would want to try to knock those things out pretty quickly early on when you're starting your family and beginning your financial planning. So 3 things every young family member or every young family should have in place regarding their finances. Starts out with kind of some protectives in the way of a will and life insurance, and then just some basic cash on hand to cover any emergencies that might come up. So will, life insurance, emergency fund, and 3B would be disability insurance. Those are the things you need to focus on first off when you're a young family. And I mentioned that I would kind of give the same 3 things that a single person and then a young married couple without kids would need. So a single person is going to be a little bit easier. Don't really need a will unless you have a lot of assets that you want to make sure go to certain places. Life insurance, probably not as important as if you have a family or if you're married. Emergency fund would be number 1. Make sure that you have enough cash on hand again to cover those emergencies. Actually, I'm going to back up. Budget would be number 1. I would say if you're on your own and you're starting out just working, the budget would be the first thing. Figure out inflows versus outflows and begin to be able to be saving. Second would be the emergency fund. That would be the second piece I would do. And then the third would be disability insurance, because if you're the sole provider for yourself and something happens to you and you can't work, then having disability insurance is probably going to be a pretty good option and pretty big need that you would have. Next up I would go, if I was going to give a 3A, it'd be get the 401k match through your employer if that's available. But for a single person with nobody else relying on them, not a single parent but just a single person themselves, start off with a budget, get things going off on the right foot and have good management of your finances. Emergency fund so that you don't have any issues and don't have to rack up a lot of bad debt. And then disability insurance, 3B being the 401k match. If you're a young couple married, they're going to be kind of a little bit of both. So the first thing I would say you would need would be life insurance. Especially if you're homeowners, you want to make sure that your surviving spouse can stay where they're at and have that debt taken care of as far as the mortgage. So life insurance probably won't need as much as if you had a family, but life insurance, emergency fund, same reasons that I listed before, and then I would go disability insurance / getting the 401k set up for the match. So depending on where you are and what your companies provide as far as benefits. So there's really only a handful of things that if you're going to confine it to 3 options, it's just depending on if there's other people that are relying on you, then you're going to need to go the more the protective route as far as insurance is first and some cash. But if it's just you, then once you kind of have a budget in place, you can start thinking about building for the future. And then eventually, most likely those single people will transition to the next level of being a married couple and then family, if that is part of the cards. So the question was about a young family. We definitely spent more time on that, but I also wanted to give those single or non-children couples out there some things to think about, making sure they have to kind of get their foundation, their financial planning and finances in shape. Okay, we're going to come back to life insurance. Our 4th question is just a simple one, but a very complex answer. how much life insurance do I need? Depends. That's one of the worst answers to hear, but it's a very common one with financial planning because there's a lot of variables that go into answering this question. And we're not even talking about what type. What do you need to consider to determine how much you need to get in the form of life insurance? It's kind of easy. You can kind of figure out what these numbers are, and it's simple addition, but what are the things you need to consider? And I'm going to kind of work through the most basic and then work up to the most complicated. So the first thing you want to think about is, final expenses. How much is it going to cost to basically have your funeral and bury you? Because you don't really want a loved one or loved ones to have to take out debt to pay for your funeral, because then they're going to have this nice reminder every month that you have passed away because they're paying down this debt. So you can look up how much it costs for the type of burial proceedings you'd want to have. So final expenses would be the first. Debts that you'd want to have paid off. So mortgages, cars, credit cards, those types of consumer debts. You don't have to worry about student loans. Those go away when you go away, basically, so you don't have to really necessarily worry about that. The student loan ends with you unless you have a cosigner or parent along on the ride with those. But if they're in your name and you pass away, the student loans end up basically being forgiven. So whatever debts you have, want to make sure those are paid off to ease the burden for your surviving spouse, if you are a married couple, or in a relationship where you're supporting each other. Next up, if family is a part of the picture and college planning is of importance, making sure that college funding is taken care of. You can run a calculation of here's what tuition is today plus additional expenses, inflate it for the future for however many years until it's going to be needed, and you can come up with how much you would need for 4 years of college. Back that down, you can figure out how much you'll need per kid or whatever your goals are. But I would wrap in making sure college is taken care of so that the surviving spouse or surviving parent doesn't have to try to fund college while they're potentially on a single income raising children. You can have that taken care of if that's a part of your wishes. Next up would be survivorship income, and maybe I would flip-flop that and put this in third position before college, but survivorship income is just basically making sure you have some income for the surviving spouse or partner to continue on without having to stress. Now, how much that is depends. Do you want to make sure that your loved one never has to work again? Or do you want to give them 6 months, a year worth of not having to worry about working, and then they'd have to get back to life as normal and working and earning an income? So there's not a right answer to that. It's just what your wishes are. Also, do you want them to go back to work full-time, or maybe they only need to work part-time, so it would require you to have more insurance to pay out to be able to invest and supplement income. But that's a part of the equation of how much do you want your survivor to receive in the form of income and how much do you want them to have to work. Depending on, again, if we have children, there's going to be an expense to take care of them depending on their age. If you have young children, you may need a nanny, you may need a babysitter, you may need childcare at a drop-off nursery or somewhere. That's going to have a cost associated with that, and it would probably make sense to build that into the calculation as well. How much does it cost? How many years will we potentially need it before they can take care of themselves? And then that kind of gives you the number to add in as well. Maybe you have family that's willing to take care of the kids for free, and that's not as important as it is for somebody who lives out of state and has no family around. But that would be another thing that sometimes gets neglected, is the expense for childcare. And then as we can kind of move further along, you have estate planning goals. So we sometimes consider this legacy. Do you want to leave money for a certain cause? Do you want to make sure the kids have an inheritance? Is there some wish that you want to make sure you have enough money to pass on if you don't have a chance to accumulate enough, or if your assets are used for other reasons? That's another reason to have insurance and another number you'd want to build in. For the most part, young families aren't too concerned about that. That's more of a need that we address later in life. But if there is something special to you that you want to make sure you're able to contribute to, if you're not here, then you can wrap that in. Another next level kind of thinking is, if you're married or in a relationship, do you want to make sure that the survivor's retirement is taken care of? So we're going to the next level of, all right, now my income is going to be gone. You're going to be working, potentially taking care of kids. you're probably not going to make enough money to save for your own retirement. So I'm going to go ahead and figure out how much you might need, or how much would I have been able to accumulate in retirement savings over my career, and we're going to make sure that you have that in the form of death benefit. So you can see that these numbers add up, and it could be a lot, or if you're single, it could be very little, if any at all. How do you approach this best? You can go out and buy your own policies. There's term versus whole life insurance. Like I said earlier, different conversation, different question, but there are different types of insurance. You can use employer policies to help get to the level that you need. One thing I would be careful of there is that insurance is usually tied to the employer. So if something happens while you're in between jobs, or God forbid you're let go and then you pass away, you may not have any insurance coverage. So I'm a fan of owning the insurance that you need, or at least the majority of it. I'm a fan of term, but it doesn't mean that the other types of insurance don't have a place for some people. But those are the things that I would say you'd want to consider to determine how much you need. And again, a financial advisor or even an insurance person is going to be able to help you work through those numbers and determine how much you need. I will also throw out one other thing that I've seen over time. Oftentimes the value of a stay-at-home parent is overlooked. The thought usually is, well, I'm the breadwinner, I make all this money, I need to replace my income. And while that's very true, there's a lot of value to a parent that stays home behind that we don't necessarily see. I mentioned before, childcare was one of the things that we would need to cover potentially, or we would want to count in there. That's why you might need more insurance on a stay-at-home parent than most people probably have, is just not thinking about the fact that there's costs to take care of the kids, watch them, clean the house potentially. So that would be something to consider, that while we all focus on the breadwinner, don't forget the person who sacrificed to stay home. While they may not have an income, there's a lot of value to what they do, and there's actually a monetary number out there that we can quantify what that would be in an annual cost, and you can take that out however many years that would go to figure out how much life insurance you might need for a stay-at-home parent. But don't neglect them. So as I mentioned, if somebody sends in a question and wants to know more about term versus whole life and why I favor one over the other, that could be another question. But that's not today's question, and we're not going to go down that road at this point. I mentioned in the previous question that whole life versus term insurance is a controversial topic. Well, we're going to hit another controversial topic. Thank you very much out there, listener, whoever sent this in. Trying to get me in trouble with my friends in the financial planning world and investment world. But the question is, number 5, do I prefer active versus passive investments, and why? Well, before I assume that everybody knows the difference between active and passive, I want to give that quick definition. So active management basically is a style of management where you have a team or a manager that is making active decisions and trying to pick investments that they think will outperform the markets. Their goal is to generate what we call alpha. Alpha is performance above what the market's done, and the belief behind active management is they can do this through research or their expertise, but they have some advantage over the market that will allow them to do better through active management rather than going the passive route. So passive investing, the best way to explain that is just kind of owning the market. Many of you are probably familiar with index funds. Index funds are passive funds. So a passive investment is an investment that does not have an active management team. There is some corresponding index that is out there, and whatever's in the index is what the fund holds. So to give you an example, the S&P 500 is the broad index for the US market. It is small to large companies, but mainly dominated by the largest companies. You can buy an S&P 500 index fund. Whether that be an index mutual fund or an index ETF, it's the S&P 500 index. It holds the S&P 500 stocks, all 500 of them, in the exact weight as the index. And whatever the index does is basically what this fund will do, plus or minus a little bit of basis points depending on how expensive the fund is and if the S&P is up or down. Meaning if the market's up, you're going to be a few percentage points lower, and if the market's down, you're going to be a few percent lower as well. So the index funds are going to do a little bit less or a little bit more if you're going down than what the index itself is doing. But index funds are very cheap. and I favor passive, or very passive-ish style. And early in my career, I was drawn to active management just because I thought it sounded fun. I thought that you could actively manage and do better. And while there are some managers that are able to do that, it's becoming increasingly harder to do so for a number of reasons. There are fewer stocks trading on the stock market today than there have been in the past. If you were to look at the number of publicly traded stocks and companies, it's fewer than it's been in the past. So there's less fish in the pond, if you will. Information is as easy as going out to Google. It's harder to get an advantage as an investment manager legally, while not having inside information, to make decisions. Information is now, via Twitter or Google, you can find out a lot of information about companies pretty quickly, and the advantage of having information is kind of going away just because it's easier to access. So the advantages that active managers have is dwindling, but the expense to pay that team and pay that manager is still there. So you're paying more for a task that is becoming harder to do, and if you look at the evidence suggests that most active managers do not consistently beat the market. So rather than pay them to do something they're not going to do, you should just pay less, own the market, and do well. There's a great blog post that I'll link to in the show notes on allaboutyourbenjamins.com from Of Dollars and Data, the blog, one of my favorite blogs. And it actually walks through how you can alleviate the reliance on the market, so alleviate the need for active management and trying to outperform the market by saving more. And now that's not always the answer for everybody, but if you're concerned that investment style isn't going to get you where you need to be, you're not sure if you should do active or passive, well, if you save more money, then it's even less important if you go active or passive. I do think there are areas where active management can do a little bit better. There's arguments that you can have active management do better in like a bond fund because of researching the companies and the bonds rather than just buying a bunch of bonds to match the index. I think there's some validity to that. Whether or not they do better by a high enough margin to overcome the cost, that may not be the case. But I do think there are certain areas, small cap, small cap companies, where there's not as much coverage. Maybe an analyst can do better, but as we get more and more reliance on technology and artificial intelligence comes into portfolio management, I think it's going to be harder and harder for the active managers to do well. So I favor passive. Earlier I said passive-ish. At my firm, and this is not to endorse any fund company, but I use dimensional funds. They're a fund company that is not technically an index fund, but the way they manage is not active either. So it's kind of passive-ish. And passive-ish in that they kind of build in some tilts and move away from just holding the market, but at the same point they're not making stock picks trying to outperform. They're using factors, which we've talked about before on another podcast. They're using factors to try to do a little bit better than the market. So they're not driving up costs, they're not terribly expensive for the format that they're in the mutual fund, but they're also not just plain vanilla indexes. So I use a lot of index ETFs with younger clients. With my older clients, I favor the dimensional funds in the portfolios with some ETFs as well. But for the most part, not a lot of active management going on at RLS Wealth Management. Go to the passive side, keep our costs low, and really focus on trying to save and have good, some good behaviors, and just be invested in the market. And at the end of the day, unless you pick a very, very, very bad active fund, I don't think, if you're saving appropriately, acting appropriately, if you choose to go active funds over passive, you're probably going to be on track to hit your goals. Passive just makes it a little bit easier for you to focus on other things and not trying to pick the best manager all the time. Just be in the market, give yourself plenty of time, and put as much money towards your goals as you can. I think that's the recipe for success going forward. I don't think that the active management will be as strong as it may have been in the past as far as their argument. So long answer, probably could have been a one-word answer, but I favor passive for lower cost, a little bit more simplicity, and just being in the market. And I would rather focus my efforts with my clients on the things that we can control and our behaviors and savings, and just let the market do a lot of the work for us. So I favor passive. There's a lot of people out there who favor active. Like I said, it's a big debate on FinTwit from time to time and investments. It's almost like it's the 90s East Coast versus West Coast hip-hop rivalry, or the Bloods and the Crips of the finance world. Active versus passive gets a lot of people heated. I don't tend to get too heated. I've got my stance, and now you know what it is, and I think you know why. But I encourage you to do your research on both formats and see what you think is best for your style and your goals. But passive gets my vote on this question. All right, we're coming up to probably the last couple questions for this round, and I'll save the others in future questions for another listeners Q&A or the AMA, whatever we want to call this. The next question is kind of continuing on with investing. Is now a good time to get into the market? If only I had that crystal ball. If I had that crystal ball, I would be kind, I would share it with all of you listeners, and we would all be in a good position. But no one has that crystal ball. No one knows, is today the best time to get into the market? So my answer to this question is a question thrown back to the listener or to someone who might ask this. What is your goal and what's your time horizon? If your time horizon is you need money next year, then I'm going to tell you no, now is probably not the time to get in the market, and not because of where we are as far as levels of the market or the fact that the market's been so good for the last 6 or 7 years, mainly because your time horizon's too short. The market's up 7 out of 10 years, but the shorter amount of time you have, the more likely you may experience a loss. And if you know you need that money in a short period of time, I don't think you should be investing it. So in that situation, now would not be the time to get to the market. If we're talking longer term, you have an infant or a young toddler, and we're talking college or we're talking retirement, then I say yes, now is the time to get in the market. There's no better time. You have enough time horizon that even if you were to invest today and the market went down tomorrow for an extended period of time, we would be disappointed. We wish we would have waited, but the market would recover and you'd be fine by the time you need the money. So if we're looking at long term, I say there's no better time than the present to get in the market, except for maybe yesterday or in the past, but we can't go back in time. So long term, get it in as soon as possible. Give yourself as much time. The longer you're in the market, the higher the odds are that you're going to see your money grow. The shorter their time horizon, the weaker the probabilities get. It's still good. 7 out of 10 times the market's up, 70% I'll take. But if I know I need that money, I don't think I want to take that risk. As far as investing, now is one of the greatest times to be investing. We have access to, as I mentioned before, very low cost investments, broadly diversified. You can build a globally diversified portfolio for next to nothing. A lot of the fund companies are on a race to zero fees. So you can invest for eventually nothing, and maybe you'll end up even getting paid a little to invest, or some of the articles out there. So from a timing as options and information and what you can invest in, there's never been a better time to be an investor. You have access to information to make good decisions. You have access to financial planners and advisors and technology to help you with the investing. And then when you get your portfolio set, you can have a very low cost investment which will work hard for you. So I'm very bullish on investing. If I wasn't, I would be changing careers because I would be telling people to do something that I don't believe in. But I think no better time than the present, especially if you have a long-term time horizon to invest. And as far as options and the ability to invest, it's never been better, and it will probably continue to get better. So the only thing is, if you have a short period of time, now may not be the time to invest. You should probably just keep some cash on hand. I wouldn't let whatever the Dow is at or the S&P is at to try to determine when you're going to get in, because you're probably going to get it wrong. There are people who are still sitting on cash from 2008 waiting for the next big market correction that has never happened, and they've missed an insane run in the stock market. So don't try to time the market. If your time horizon permits it, get in. Never better time than now. You're only missing out on compounding interest and increasing probability that your money will work for you harder and grow in the long term. So get to it if you have a long term. Short term, hold off and just sit on some cash until you get to that short-term goal. All right, the final question for this inaugural listener's question episode is one I don't think I will see in 10 years. The question is, with someone who has a pension, but that's why I don't think we'll have this question in 10 years. Somebody who has a pension, should your investment strategy be more conservative or more aggressive? Does the pension change the approach to investing? So my answer to that is, if your risk tolerance allows it, I think the pension gives you the affordability to take on more risk with your portfolio. You can almost view that pension, that guaranteed income stream, we think is guaranteed, should be guaranteed, that guaranteed income stream of the pension can act as like the bond part of your portfolio, allowing you to take risk on your 401k, your IRA, your 403b, whatever it may be, since you have this security and this foundation in the form of a pension. So I think it allows you to be more aggressive, especially when you're younger. I think you need to also make sure that whatever level of risk, whatever you define as aggressive, matches your risk tolerance. Meaning, it's all great that you have a pension and you can go 100% equities and you're being very aggressive, but the next time we have a big market correction or crash even, if you panic and sell, then all that aggressiveness you took because you had that pension is going to go out the window, and it really wasn't worth it. I'd rather see somebody be moderate instead of overly aggressive if that keeps them invested when times get tough. Because in the moment, it's easy to sell and get out, but that's the worst thing to do. And if you're not taking on more risk than you can handle, even if you have a pension, you're more likely to stay in the game. So on paper, in theory, having a pension should allow you to take on more risk because you have a baseline, you have some stability, you have guaranteed income that you can rely on, which allows you to take more risk with the portfolio. That being said, you'll probably hear me say that a lot over the time with episodes like this. That being said, having a pension may also allow you to be more conservative depending on your goals. So stay with me. I just told you to be aggressive, but this could allow you to be conservative. And the way this could work is, if you have a very large pension or you have very, very low expenses going into retirement and your pension makes up all or most of your income needs, then when you sit down on paper and you crunch the numbers, you may not need to get a lot of growth from your portfolio. If you have a pension, meets most of your needs, you have a big nest egg because you've done a good job of saving over the years, then you may not need to generate a lot of growth to get the extra income that you need. So the pension actually allows you to take on less risk because you don't need to get a lot of growth, if that makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, if the goal is to generate $40,000 a year of supplemental income because you have a nice pension and you have $1 million, it takes 4% to get your $40,000. Now, that's not taking into consideration taxes, and we obviously want to try to grow, but if you only had $500,000, now you need 8% growth just to get that $40,000 income, which would require you to take on more risk to get that, to take into consideration the taxes and continuing to grow. So the whole point of bringing that illustration up is, if you have a big pension that meets most of your needs and you saved a lot of money, those two combined could allow you to take on less risk if that fits your preferences. I'm going to add one more with that being said, but if you're in a situation where you have a big nest egg and you have a big pension, you may not need all that money, and now you're starting to think about estate planning, then maybe you want to go back to being aggressive again with some of your investments, because now you're really investing for your heirs, and they have an even longer time horizon, which means you could take on more risk with that portfolio. So I know that may have been a bit confusing, and I'm glad, because that's the type of conversation, that's what makes my job as a financial advisor and all the other advisors out there that are doing real financial planning, that's what gives us so much value. It's not the active versus passive debate and which funds to use. It's looking at your situation and all the variables and figuring out, how do we make things work, and what are your options, and what can you do and what can't you do. So going back to the original question, I know I got off on a tangent, but back to the original question, on paper, having a pension should allow you to take on more risk if you're comfortable with it. View that pension kind of as your bond, your safety net, the conservative part, and if you can stomach big ups and downs, then you have the affordability to take on a little bit more risk. But at the same time, if you have done a good job and now you're getting close to retirement, you have a big pension, you have lower needs, you should be covered mostly on those needs from the pension, and you have that big nest egg, then you probably don't need to take on as much risk because you don't need to get as much growth. And then we get into the confusing part of, now we look at estate planning if that's your situation, and maybe you want to ratchet up that growth to set your heirs up or your goals up for the longer legacy goals even more. So that's my answer. I kind of stewed over this one for a while to make sure I hit all the angles, but it's not as easy of an answer as you might think it would be, just because there's so many variables and so many different goals that people may have. And again, that's why advisors, that's the value that we bring in our job. It's not picking investments. So I'm going to make that our last question. I've got a couple more left over. We'll hold on until next time. Please, 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 if you have more questions, whether it's planning or investment or insurance or anything that has been covered on the blog or covered on the podcast, add in the nutrition and fitness as well, please send those to me. Contact at allaboutyourbenjamins.com, tweet at Justin Castelli, send a DM. I would love to do this maybe every couple months, knock out 7 or 8 questions each time and kind of answer some questions. I'm going to end with the disclaimer that although I'm answering these questions, this is not advice to your personal situation, not even to the people who answered it. It's more up to give you a general idea of where your thought process needs to be, things you need to consider, and hopefully give you the questions you need to arm yourself to ask an advisor, ask an insurance person, ask professional help to figure out what's the best case scenario for you. So this is not advice to your situation because I don't know the particulars, but I can give you a very high level look and the things you need to consider through these questions that will give you the ability to ask more questions to figure out what it is that you need in different scenarios. So talk to your advisor, reach out to an advisor if you have questions how this pertains to your particular situation. So our industry loves those disclaimers, but they're necessary. Don't go out and act on anything I said today without talking to a professional to make sure it's right for you and to determine what's the best way to execute. So with that, we'll end this. As I mentioned earlier, I've got a lot of great guests coming up this summer. I don't want to name drop quite yet, but I'm pretty excited, and you'll know when those come. And the great thing is that continues my string of great guests. My guests have been awesome to date, and they're going to continue to be awesome. I'm real excited. I hope you're all enjoying it. If you are, I would love and I would appreciate if you would give a review on iTunes, throw some 5 stars, 4 stars, whatever you think I deserve. Throw that up there so I can kind of help get this moving in front of other people. Apple really values those reviews. I would love it too as feedback just to make sure I'm doing a good job and kind of make this what you're looking for. So thank you for listening. Thanks to all my guests so far. Episode 15 is a wrap and it's just me. Questions from the listeners. We'll do this again in the future. Send those questions in. And with that, we'll see you in the next episode.